the misconception about the book of Psalms is that the reading strategy is actually not to function first as a hymn book or a prayer book. It's not just something that becomes a mental exercise that you do silently in the morning with a cup of coffee. What ends up happening is that you're actually involving your whole being. If you meditate on this Torah, aka listen to my voice, like, you will flourish like a tree in a garden planted by waters of life. So what do you do if you want Eden to return and immerse yourself into the Eden world? You immerse yourself in Torah. And by learning the wisdom and justice of God, and then by that way, you actually enter back into the temple, back into God's presence, and you become a tree. So it's even making like a really punchy statement about, this is actually what you're made for. You're designed for the instruction of God. And so the idea is that you become a tree of life. Like, you then become this like self-generating life source for other people. So again, the choice is yours. Like, what do you want to become? I want to become a tree of life.
Well, hello everyone, and welcome to another episode of Theology Re-Examined. Today I have with me a very special guest, Aaron Shaw. Aaron, thanks for joining me today.
Happy to be here.
Yeah, if you will, we got some time last week to connect and just talk about a little bit of your story, talk about who you are, what you're doing. If you could, please share some of that with us. Let us know kind of what you're up to, who you are, and why you're here.
Totally. Yeah. Like I said, my name is Aaron. I currently live in Portland, Oregon. I work at a ed tech animation studio nonprofit that makes cartoons about the Bible called Bible Project. And I also serve as a graduate fellow or TA at Western Seminary, that's also located here in Portland.
Okay, awesome. And just to help people get acquainted with kind of who you are and your story, could you share as much as you're willing just about your upbringing, how you came to how you came to believe that Jesus of Nazareth was somebody worth following?
Yeah, definitely. My upbringing was confusing and complex. Um, I was raised in a secular Jewish home, and that shaped the world in a very profound way, to a point where I I don't remember how old I was, but there was at some point where I really wanted to take on Judaism as like a whole worldview, and I was probably like 8 or 9. Like, I was really young. And I knew I was like, this is what I want. I want the bar mitzvah. I want everything. And there was within our family, I think that there were dynamics that didn't allow that to necessarily happen as much as I would want to. But the Jewish part of my story became really critical in college, because I started having, you get to college, or at least, college in the context that I was in at the University of Minnesota. Like, I was really after trying to seek some sort of truth and try to reconcile my Jewish upbringing. And so I would go to the Jewish groups and I would hang out with them, and we would chat, and I'd meet with rabbis and we would chat about the Bible. And then I would go to Christian groups and I would go and hang out with them, because I was being invited like every other day to like some Christian thing where they're like, hey, here's free pizza. Also, we're going to pray for you. And I was like, wait, what is this? And so I was really confused. I was just like, well, no, I'm Jewish. Like, no, I don't. But what ended up happening was there was something that happened within the first couple of meetings that I went to, where I started realizing that that Jesus of Nazareth was Jewish. And that wasn't something that was like overtly discussed in my home growing up, but it was something that finally started to click for me in college, where I was like, wait, if Jesus is Jewish and his messianic kingdom is birthed out of a Jewish tradition, then that means that Jesus is the Jewish Messiah, which means that there might actually be some compatibility between Judaism and Jesus. And so I started doing, and I spent the rest of the 3 years in college. I jokingly call it, I was majoring in Bible and minoring in college, because I was obsessed with reading the Bible and doing, campus ministry oriented stuff and meeting with people. And eventually, sometime within the first 2 years, I came to some sort of conclusion or realization. I was like, yeah, I think that Jesus really is Messiah. Like, this is wow, what a wild turn of events. Like, this is insane. And started following Jesus. And so, yeah, then after that, it became a long path of being in and out of ministry and pastoral ministry, and then eventually making a turn to academia within the last 2 or 3 years or so. And that kind of brings us to here. So, yeah, lots of
Yeah.
grad school, more grad school, more grad school, and more grad school. But
Yeah.
here we
So
are.
the point is that you kind of know a little bit about what we're about to talk about, and
I mean, I hope I
that
do.
that yeah. Uh, so today I brought Aaron on because we wanted to discuss and have some conversations around Psalm 1 specifically. Um, what does it mean? Well, I guess I'll just open us with reading it. I'll just read it through,
Mm.
and I'll read in the NIV, but I imagine that you'll give us a better translation, probably in your own words. But the NIV reads, "Blessed is the one who does not walk in step with the wicked, or stand in the way that sinners take, or sit in the company of mockers, but whose delight is in the law of the Lord, and who meditates on his law day and night. That person is like a tree planted by streams of water, which yields its fruit in season, and whose leaf does not wither. Whatever they do prospers." So that's the first half of the psalm, and that's what we're really going to narrow in on this today as we talk about these things. So, Aaron, if you can, is there any necessary context that we need to comprehend before jumping right into it?
Oh, such a good question. Yes, there's all kinds of context. It's always needed. It's always an exercise of parts and wholes. So,
Okay.
yeah, before we dive into Psalm 1, because I'm really excited to share some of the things that I've been reflecting on Psalm 1. I was thinking maybe I'll just play tour guide and just kind of like take us from like 100,000 feet and then just slowly land the plane and get us down to Psalm 1, if that's okay, and get us some
Yeah.
context. Um, so we'll start with the largest way to get context, and that the whole Hebrew Bible, the whole thing. So Psalms belongs to a collection called the Hebrew Bible. The Hebrew Bible is telling a story about God's partnership with humanity, and his purpose for doing this is to give a gift to humans, namely the power to distribute good into the world. And he does this by blessing them and calling them to listen to his voice. They will become like him, and they will make order, and they will give peace. And human flourishing will happen everywhere, right? And this is the first few chapters of the Bible in Genesis 1. The idea that God creates humanity in his likeness and his image and says, okay, now, as I have filled and I have ordered and I have brought peace and brought human flourishing, now you go and unpack the potential of the world that I've created. And so that is the blessing, the gift that I give to you, is to take this and to go and then to be able to make the world a beautiful place, right? Plant gardens and start families and build neighborhoods and see that everybody is cared for. So those are the first few chapters after that. But then the rest of the Hebrew Bible is organized into three parts. So Genesis and that whole introduction is part of what we call the Torah. And there's the prophets and then the writings, right? Three ways of breaking it down. The Torah introduces a worldview where God is calling his people, and he is calling a particular type. He's calling one person, Abraham, and Abraham then becomes the vehicle of blessing the whole world in Genesis 12 through 15. So Abraham becomes a bearer of this covenant, this promise to humanity that whatever God is going to do, his focus is going to be blessing the nations, right? It's going to bless them so that they get to partake and share in the power and the presence of the God of Israel. So that's the Torah. We move to Moses and the liberation of the Exodus, but eventually the rest of the Torah then is this long, drawn out, epic narrative of how God's people do not listen to his voice. Again, the intent was that they would listen to his voice and that they would carry
Mhm.
this blessing to the nations. And the rest of the Hebrew Bible is this, or at least just the end of the prophets, is this long, long, long epic of Israel attempting to do their best with really good intentions to follow and to listen, but then the prophets raising up these sort of covenant watchdogs, correcting and saying, no, you're missing it. Like, you're missing the point. Like, you're actually harming each other. You're actually harming the nations around you. Like, you're actually not listening. Hear, O Israel, like, the Lord your God, like, he's the one alone that you should be serving and worshiping. Like, you've given your life to this. You're a part of the people. Like, follow through. And so that's the end of the prophets, and it ends with essentially them going into exile and the destruction of Jerusalem, and God saying, I will bring you back. I will love you and I will bring you back. But there is a time where rest is needed. A reset is needed. I'm still covenantly faithful to you. I will not abandon you, but we need a bit of a reset. And so then we get to the last collection, which is the Ketuvim, the writings. And the very first book of the Ketuvim picks up that story. So that whole story, so everything that I just walked through in a very, very fast overview, like that whole story has to be kind of understood as we get to the Psalms, because the Psalms are reflecting on all the key vocab and all the key words and all the key stories that are happening throughout Genesis all the way through Second Kings. And so they overall are functioning, or at least the Psalms seem to be functioning in a lot of ways, as like an anthology of like Israel's history. And they do it through a particular mode of poetry. So that's like the story that we're working with when we enter into the world of Psalms, is essentially reflecting on all of Israel's history. And there's a few nuances that I'll make eventually, but that's sort of the introduction. It's like the Psalms are an anthology of Israel's history and reflecting on all of that history, all of Israel's history in these 150 Psalms. So that's like the context, at least like chronologically, is like what are the Psalms working with? But then even Psalms is even designed in a particular way, where the Psalms is actually made up of songs and poems and everything. But the misconception, and this is where maybe we'll start to have some back and forth, is like the misconception about the book of Psalms is that the reading strategy is actually not to function first as a hymn book or a prayer book. The Psalms are actually first and foremost to be functioning as actually like you're to actually read it through, like start to finish. And the reason that that's the case is because when we realize the way that the Psalms are designed, it's actually very meticulous, and it's arranged in a particular way that tells this story of Israel, and it tells it in different ways through different stories and cycles and poems. But overall, like the main point is that Psalms is intended to be read from start to finish. It has a clear beginning, it has an ending, it has this really beautiful, straightforward 5-part design right in the middle. And they have all these interrelationships within them that just continue to affirm. It's like, yeah, this is supposed to be read as one thing all the way through. It tells a story. So anyway, the Psalms are not, I guess, because when I say that they reflect on Israel's history, one of the things that ends up happening is people say, oh, so it's just this ad hoc thing that was added to the end of all of Israel's history. There's just sort of like a mismatch of all these different things. It's like, actually, it's not like it's not an ad hoc collection of random poems. It's actually intentional. It's actually a crafted document with particular design that actually in and of itself suggests a way of reading. Like it actually gives you like a manual of like, this is how you're supposed to read it. This is how you're supposed to understand the story. Let me give you a perspective to be able to meditate on, and this can become your prayer or your song. But overall, like follow the journey that we're taking you on. So that's just like the overall thing, is that the Psalms, the Psalter, is not a random collection of psalms, but were designed to be coherent, and that they have been positioned in a particular way that affirms like how crucial it is for us to read it in terms of its structure, and that structure then helps us understand the theology of the Psalter, and that like sets the tone then for like the whole psalm. So like when we come to Psalm 1, we have to realize like, one, we are importing the anthology of Israel's history and the reflection back on that history, but then we also have to recognize that Psalm 1's starting an entire separate collection that is then not ad hoc, but actually very intentionally crafted with a particular message in a particular way. And so that gives us a lot of structure and like a lot of guardrails that are actually really helpful for understanding like what the Psalms are and like what they're doing in context.
So the point is that in this conversation, we're not just exegeting Psalm 1, but we're getting an overview of how to approach the entire book, is what you're saying.
Yeah. And it's one of the things that I like to remind people is that no matter what we're working with, whether you're working with a verse or a chapter or a book, like everything is always an exercise in parts of wholes. Everything is always a part of a whole. So if you take one verse, that's fine. But then when you realize that that verse actually belongs into a larger paragraph and that paragraph belongs to a chapter, then what happens is you start to understand more of what that section is trying to communicate by putting it within its context and looking at the structure. So one of the things that has been sort of a guiding sort of axiom for interpretation for me, and then sort of what I pass to the students that I work with, or some of the work that even here at Bible Project, is simply affirming that structure will determine a lot of the time the meaning of a text. And so if we want to start with Psalm 1, well, we should understand the whole design of the Hebrew Bible, the Torah, the prophets, and the writings. And then once we double click on the writings, the first book of that would then be the Psalms. And then we'll understand, okay, so let's just understand the Psalms as a whole. Great, now let's understand Psalm 1 and 2, because actually you can't understand Psalm 1 without understanding Psalm 2. Then once we do that, then we can go to Psalm 1, and then we can go to the portion that you read at the beginning.
Yeah.
But that's like the elevation like work that we have to do if we just want to understand, like, so what are we starting with? Like, how is this all designed? And I think that the structure of these books really, really matters for the way that we understand coherence and we make sense of actually what's happening, what's being said within these texts.
Yeah. Is it safe to say, because if anyone listening this were to open their Bible, they would find, like you mentioned, that the book of Psalms is broken up into 5 different books. Is it safe to say that the book of Psalms is almost being presented as a new Torah? Like a new, I mean, the 5 has to be significant here. A new way for the people of God to meditate on this literature in order to form them in a similar way that the Torah was meant to.
Yeah. No, that's exactly right. The Psalms are, in their 5-part design, often reflect in some thematic ways, in some of the key vocabulary, but are generally connected to the concept of the Torah being designed in 5 parts. And the idea is that if you read the Torah and then you go and read the Psalter and you put them next to each other, you'll realize that there is a lot of shared relationship between them, and they both have a similar reading strategy. Especially when you look at the way that they both start. You have Genesis 1 starting with humans being told you can bear fruit like a tree. The tree is what gives you life, and that is in analogy in the Genesis account to God saying, like, listen to my voice, follow the wisdom that I've given you. And that's exactly how Psalm 1 starts. Psalm 1 starts with saying, like, if you meditate on this Torah, aka listen to my voice, like, you will flourish like a tree in a garden planted by waters of life. So it's echoing a lot of the same language and trying to foster a particular level of meditation. And so there is absolutely connections between them, and that, if you finished reading the Torah and let's say that you skipped all of, Joshua all the way through Second Kings, you're just like, I just don't want to read that right now, and you just jump all the way to the Psalms, like, you would probably be able to pick that up and be like, hey, wait a second, this is designed just like that is. How interesting. And like you could see some of the similar themes in the similar ways that they go through. And there's other works that have been done on this. That's not a new idea. Tons of other scholars have pointed out the interrelationships and the intertextuality between the Torah and between the Psalter. But anyway, there are significant connections that are, if we had more time, that would be a fun way to spend an afternoon. But time doesn't permit us to do that.
Yeah. Okay. So if we're going to get into then trying to hone in more specifically on this chapter, or maybe even just the former part of this chapter, then help us. What should we know first? Because we've kind of given a more broad overview. You mentioned it's helpful to know Psalm 2. Do you want to jump into that first, or should we try? Okay. Yeah. You're saying yes.
Yeah. Let's do that. Yeah. No, let's definitely do Psalm 1 and 2 together. So here's what I want you to do. Can you actually go to Psalm 3 for me?
Yeah.
And this will be a fun little exercise. But if you go to Psalm 3, I don't, whatever version you want, whatever you find.
Okay.
But just read for me in your Bible, if you're reading the NIV, it probably is a superscription of the title of the Psalm. Yeah. What is the title of that?
A Psalm of David when he fled from his son Absalom.
Perfect. Okay. So just to get context here, when we come across those, we call them like superscriptions or like a little title of the Psalm, in our English Bibles, they're not considered the first verse. They're usually considered just a superscription. It's kind of written above the actual first verse. In Hebrew, that is actually verse 1. So there's just already a difference between them. It's like, okay, like, what are we working with? Well, we're working with Hebrew texts, and the Hebrew texts actually take the superscriptions, and that is actually verse 1. Now, if you go back to Psalm 1, what does Psalm 1 start with? Is there any superscription on Psalm 1 in the Bible, in the translation that you're reading from?
Let's see. No, mine just says Psalms 1 through 41, book 1.
There you go. And then what about Psalm 2? Is there any introduction? Any superscription at all on your Bible?
No, there's not.
Okay, so this is why this is important. So, the whole first book of the Psalms, Psalm 1 through 41, are what we would call like book one. That's book one of the Psalms. And all of them have a superscription of something like, of David, to David, something around the context. But Psalms 1 and 2, and there's a little asterisk here because Psalms 9 and 10 is a unique instance because Psalms 9 and 10 actually are supposed to be one psalm, but and you can go see that in Septuagint in the Old Greek affirm that. But every single one of the Psalms has a title except for Psalms 1 and 2.
Yeah, from
So they
3 to
stick out
40.
like just that first fact is just like when you read the Psalms 1 and 2 don't have a title, but Psalms 3 all the way through 41 minus 10 with that one small instance, all of them have titles. And so even if you just take that at face value, you're forced to have to meditate on like, okay, why would Psalms 1 and 2 not have a title? Like that doesn't make any sense. If all the other ones have titles, why are the first two don't have titles? And typically the intuition is to say like, well, then they must be special, right? They must be set aside for something. There's something unique about their just existence at the beginning. There's something there. And so Psalms 1 and 2 actually serve as the introduction to the whole Psalter, which is why they don't have titles. They just give you, they are in and of themselves a meditation on the process of like how to read this literature, how to read the Psalms, how to read the whole Hebrew Bible, but actually how to read the Psalms. And so all 150 Psalms will find their essential vocabulary and theme and purpose just within Psalms 1 and 2. So primarily, the mega themes here, and they can be broken down into sub-themes, but the mega themes are the Torah, the Messiah, and the temple. And that all of that is all then gets us what is to just Psalm 1, right? So now we've done Psalm 1 and 2 that serve as dual introductions, right? Dual kind of like, I don't know what you call them, like maybe
Preface,
like
or
yeah,
just
they're a preface, but it's like stereo, right? You have two different ways of hearing something rather than just like like mono. It's stereo. You're actually hearing two different ways of being able to read the Psalter. So that is all basically what gets us then to Psalm 1. So Psalm 1 then starts off by giving us these categories, right? And it tells us about the righteous and how they submerge themselves into the Torah because the Torah has eternal life. So in Jewish and rabbinic thought, the Torah, the Word of God, is considered to be a tree of life or the tree of life, right? It's the source of life. So what do you do if you want Eden to return and immerse yourself into the Eden world? You immerse yourself in Torah. And by learning the wisdom and justice of God, and then by that way, you actually enter back into the temple, back into God's presence, and you become a tree. And then everything that you do to all the people around you then becomes, well, actually, I'm getting out of myself. So let's just pedal. Actually, let me pause right there. How does that sound? How you doing?
Yeah, it's helpful.
Okay. So here's the plot conflict. Okay. Imagine that you could actually do this exercise no matter where you live, but just imagine that you live anywhere, right? And you are looking out at the world that you live in, and you notice or experience firsthand that there is corruption and violence and oppression, right? And let's say that you read the Torah and you're realizing that God, Yahweh, the King of all the universe, right? And you recognize him and you're saying, yes, I follow him. And through him and listening to his Torah, living by his wisdom and doing justice and showing mercy, like you can see God's rule become more apparent here on earth, right? The more that you lean into God's wisdom and let it actually change you, you can go out and actually change the world, right? Humans actually begin to flourish because of the love of God. So, but again, you're still wrestling with the tension of like, I know and I'm convinced that like this has something to bear on my life and my community's life. But I look out the window and I see war and famine and crime and brutality. So how do you reconcile these two worldviews? Like, how do you reconcile the fact that it's like I'm living in a world where I believe that God really is the king of the universe, but at the same time, how can this God also be the same God then overseeing and looking at all of this corruption? Like, how do I reconcile these two views? And that's exactly the plot conflict that Israel is stuck in. Right, and then them sometimes are the ones who are perpetrating some of that brutality, but then they themselves are also often victims of that brutality from other nations. And so, just in general, like the Psalms are like they just give you a very sober view of the world. A
Yeah.
very, very sober view on reality, and like the tension that you really have when you go through like your life, or you reconcile like having a very high view of like, I know that this is true, but what about this? So the question then becomes like, how do you as a human live out God's wisdom and resist all of that, the brutality and all of that? How do you resist that by not, but without losing hope, like without getting cynical? Like how do you do that? How do you hold on to the promise that God is going to re-Edenize the earth and make everything right?
Hmm.
Right? So that right there, like, now we've gotten down to Psalm 1, but then like that's the question, right? Because if we're summarizing the anthology of Israel's history, and then we're also saying like, okay, and it's beginning this book that's going to essentially try to summarize the whole of Israel's story and do it through poetry, it's going to give us both positive and also like horrible experiences that Israel has gone through, both the good and the bad. And so all these questions and narratives are inside the minds of the scribes who crafted this text. So that's like the world that we're walking into, and the plot conflict and the tension that we want to hold as we get here. So imagining that in one sense you have your hands open and saying, I love God and I want to serve him and worship him, and I believe that his promises are true. But yet you look out the window and you see somebody stealing a car, and you see someone being hurt, and you hear about a diagnosis or this or that, and so you're like, how in the world am I supposed to reconcile all of these things? Like, is there a way to resist the cynicism that creeps in that tells me that maybe God's promises aren't actually true? And that's where we start with Psalm 1.
Okay. So then that first line, whenever you hear Ashrei is the one, right? Like blessed is the one, that's appealing then. Because if this is your reality, you want to know what it, like, oh, who's the blessed one? How do I get this? How do I obtain this? So then I don't know. For me, even that's appealing because I want the blessing and I want to know what it means to actually have that be my reality instead of the reality of death and horrible tragedies and all of this stuff. So help us then, like whenever we start reading this chapter or this section of the scroll. Um, what does this mean for someone to be Ashrei? I know that you guys at the Bible Project, you have a thing going on right now where you're walking through the Sermon on the Mount, or right now in real time for consumers. It's for you guys. I know you did it a while ago, but you, I know, made your own translation of the Sermon on the Mount, and you guys, I don't know if you had a part in this, but you guys chose to translate it as the good life belongs to, or so for example here it might read the good life belongs to the one who walks in this and this.
Yeah.
Thoughts on that? Did you play a role in that? Is that a way that you would translate it? And then help us, like, is that a helpful way to think about it, better than blessed? Because blessed is just loaded with so much different baggage. It's like, what does that even mean anymore?
Yeah, yeah, totally. Yeah. Um, yeah, so I did not have a hand in the decision per se. Most of the translation that we used for Sermon on the Mount was something that was an adaptation of just sort of a literary literal. Like, we were just observing the patterns and then trying to use and reflect the language in the translation of the design of the text itself. And so some of that, yes, some of that I didn't have a hand in. It just depended on which section and whatnot. But the decision that we did go with ultimately for our translation was to use, yeah, how good is the life
Mm-hmm.
for the one, right? How good is the life? And so, yeah, so you mentioned the word blessed, and then there's this other, and then this one, I think that most translations go with like happy, I think, or like
Really?
happy is the one. I could be wrong.
Oh wow, I've never
But
heard of that. That's interesting.
yeah, so we can do this real time.
Okay.
We'll just do Psalm 1 and go to yeah, let's go to this. So the NRSV starts out with happy are those who.
Oh wow.
The complete Jewish Bible goes with how blessed are those. The Net Bible, second edition, how blessed is. NIV blessed is. ESV blessed is. And NASB 2020 goes with blessed is. So there's some variation here. Not a
Mm-hmm.
lot, but there is some variation here. But yeah, there is a difference between blessed and then this other word we're using, like the good life belongs to the one who. And that word is ashrei. So we have Baruch, which is blessed, and then there's ashrei, which is often translated happy, but sometimes conflated with blessed. But it really means is that you're reflecting on somebody else's state of being that you're observing. And so in this sense, this is saying like you are looking at someone and saying like, oh, how good is the life for the person who, right? You're not necessarily saying like, oh, they're blessed, right? You're
Yeah.
saying like, no, I can observe, like there's an observable trait about the way that this person lives, and they are at the center of God's power and presence. That's
Yeah.
where they are. They're at the center of God's power and presence, and that you're observing something in a state of someone's existence. So we went with that, and that's the same word that's first here. Ashrei ha'ish. How good is the life for the one, the man? And then it gives three different negative clauses here. Who doesn't walk, doesn't stand, and does not sit in the counsel of the wicked, the path of sinners, and the seat of mockers. So just even as you look at that and kind of hear that, do you notice that there's already something being set up? There's kind of three things that you are not supposed to be. It goes from walking to sit to standing to sitting.
Yeah.
And
Progression.
then, yeah, there's a progression. So walking to standing to sitting is showing a state of becoming more and more fixed and stuck,
Yeah.
right? So
Complacent.
these themes, what's that?
I say complacent even. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a complacency almost to the way that this particular way of life um, is the good life does not belong to someone who eventually gets stuck and who's somebody who eventually becomes complacent and hangs out with the wicked, the sinners, and the mockers. Essentially, these three categories will be repeated through Psalms, and they'll be even repeated through Proverbs and play a role even sometimes in the prophets. But all of them are examples of things that, I mean, without oversimplifying it, you don't want to be these people.
Yeah.
Essentially, it's the gist. You don't want to be these types of people. And we'll talk about why that's important. But so, how good is the life for the somebody who doesn't do this, who doesn't walk, doesn't sit, and doesn't stand with basically company of people who are out to perpetuate chaos and perpetuate brutality and injustice and inhumanity. However, this person, they delight in the, and now what did your translation read for that right there?
Mine says law of the Lord.
Law of the Lord. That is perfectly ambiguous. I love it. So, I like the CJB, the Complete Jewish Bible here. I think that this is really good. I'm trying to see if there's any other ones who render it this way. This is actually the only translation I think that gets to this. But their delight is in the Torah. The word here is actually law is fine, but one thing to notice that this is the instruction word is the word for Torah. It's just Torah, right?
Yep.
Your delight is in Torah, the instruction. So law I think is misleading, but the point is that there's something unique about the instruction that God gives to humanity. And again, this is recalling back to Genesis 1 and the instruction that God gives, be fruitful, multiply, eat from any tree of the garden. Like it's all yours. You don't need this one tree. This one tree does not concern you. So don't worry about it. There is an abundance. There's no scarcity. So go and listen to my instruction. So delight in the instruction of God. And on his instruction, and then what does your translation have?
He meditates on his law day and night.
Yes. Okay. So this word is the word Haggah. And this is a very important word, but it's used to describe the sound of a pigeon
Yeah.
when it's like
Cooing.
perched up and it's content and it coos, or a bear that's moaning as it's like eating, like I don't know, a deer or an elk or something. It's just like it's devouring and eating it. But this
One
word is
lexicon I
used.
read said growling, like when he hovers over his prey, he's
Yeah.
growling.
Yes. Yeah. There's something about a satisfaction. There's a factor of satisfaction that comes with this word. There's something about a satisfactory nature, right? When pigeons are at rest, they coo. When bears are eating food, they're at rest because that's where they want to be. They want to be eating food because it's enjoyable. It's what they're made to do.
Yeah.
But for humans, what it means is that it means to quietly recite the words of Scripture aloud. That's essentially the meaning, is that like you repeat it out loud, you mutter it to yourself, like it's an audible sound. You audibly talk about the instruction. That's essentially what it is. But what it really means is you're muttering out loud, but what's happening in that moment when you're muttering it to yourself is that you're focusing your mind and your attention so that these words become something that you read and engage with your whole body. It's not just something that becomes a mental exercise that you do silently in the morning with a cup of coffee. What ends up happening is that you're actually involving your whole being into it. You're actually muttering it out loud. So that's the word haga and meditate, and why this is important is because this will actually, the same word, the same root haga will actually occur in Psalm 2,
Mm.
and we'll get to that in a second. But how? So there's the meditate. So in meditate, and we'll get to day and night in a second. But how's that work?
Yeah. Yeah, there you go. That's good.
Okay. So we have meditating on the instruction of God day and night. This figure of speech is really just a shorthand for like always.
Hmm.
Not like just all the time, like always. It's just always there.
What about in the
But
afternoon?
actually, what's that?
I said, what about in the afternoon? Does that count? Or
Oh, of course, it's during the day. Yeah, it's during the day. If you were to go though, and go pull from the Dead Sea Scrolls, go to 1QS 6 through 7. There's actually a reference of the Qumran community where the Minyan Jewish men would study the Torah around the clock, and they would tag each other in and out of a Torah study
Mm.
24/7.
Wow. So
They're just
they're
like constantly
always
studying, which, like, I don't know, that sounds really fun to me. Like, I would want to do that.
yeah.
But anyway, so the point is here is that it's just saying, like, this is something that you are to engage with all the time. This is something that is not supposed to be just kind of like when you feel like it, but something that is constantly done. It's muttering to yourself when you're, out in your field, and when you're at the markets, and when you're engaging with a neighbor, and when you go to synagogue, and when you do this. It's like, it's just all the time. Torah everywhere, Torah everything. It's just
Yeah.
always on your lips. The instruction is something that you are rehearsing with your vocal cords, and rehearsing with your body, rehearsing out loud to yourself. So that's the idea here, is that the delight is the instruction, and in the instruction they meditate. So whatever you meditate on is the thing you delight in, and the thing you delight in you meditate on. Does that make sense? It's kind of like this
Yeah.
infinity loop, but there's a symmetry. There's a symmetry to that second verse. In his delight is the instruction of Yahweh, and on his instruction he meditates day and night.
Mm.
Right? You catch the symmetry there?
Yeah.
A, B, B, A. It's a really nice symmetry that goes there. So, um,
Yeah, real quick, I'll interrupt you to
yeah,
ask a question.
please.
Delight. Now, I know it's a different Hebrew word than what's used for Eden, but
Mm.
they have the same meaning, right? So Eden means delight, and then here, this Hebrew word that's used in Psalm 1 also means delight. Different word, but same meaning. Is there attempt at a connection there?
Yeah, they're synonyms of each other. This one, I believe, is chafetz, to delight in, or chafetz. This is a word that essentially describes, yeah, just something pleasing, something enjoyable, something that, it would go along with the idea of hagaing, of like a bear. It's enjoying
Mhm.
its meal, right? It's something that it's designed for. So the delight is in the instruction. It's in, how would you say it? Maybe it's a delight. um, it's the pure and natural enjoyment of the thing that you ultimately are made for.
Hmm.
Let me put it that
Okay.
way. Um, there are ways that you can skew that desire and that delight into really bad things, but in this case, it's trying to make a case that, like, your delight is in the instruction of God. Like, that's actually what you're made for, is for the instruction of God. So it's even making like a really punchy statement about, this is actually what you're made for. You're
Hmm.
designed for the instruction of God. Why? Well, because you meditate on it day and night. It's good.
Yeah.
It's good for you. It gives you life.
Yeah. Okay.
So, with that all said, let's jump quickly back over to Psalm 2 for a second. So, if you can, and I need to pull my Psalm 2 up, but could you read for me Psalm 2 verse 1?
Yeah. Why do the nations conspire and the prophets plot in vain? Or the peoples plot in vain is how mine
Yeah,
reads.
yeah, the Amim, the people. Why do the people plot in vain? So, Ethan, what do you think that word plot is in Hebrew?
Oh, oh man. I imagine is it trying to get with the scheming serpent, or is there an
Ooh,
allusion there?
that would be a that actually would be really interesting. But ironically, it's actually the word Haggah.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah. So here's what's really interesting about this. There is a really interesting interplay between Psalm 1 and 2. They're assuming something about humanity, right? So in Psalm 1, it's assuming it's like, yeah, you're designed for the delight and the Haggah on Torah, on the instruction of God, listening to his voice. But then in Psalm 2, you're getting almost a counterexample. They're
Mm,
plotting in vain and emptiness with destruction in mind. So here's the reflection. You and I are, and everyone else too, we are all meditating or focusing our attention on something.
mm-hmm,
The two things that you can meditate on are either the instruction of God, or you can plot against, and then this psalm will go on to fill out what exactly the plotting against is. But it's you are focusing your attention on resisting the Messiah, the Messiah of God. But what I've come to understand with this is that it's assuming that you and I already focus our attention on something already, and the choice is not whether on we are focusing or not focusing. It's on you're already focusing on something. It's
mm,
one of the two. You are already occupying your attention in the focus of your mind and your behaviors and your personality towards something and some goal. That's the binary that Psalms is setting up, is saying like you are already focusing your attention on something. It's not a
yeah,
question of, oh, maybe I am, but maybe I'm not. It's like, no, you are. You're being formed and shaped into a type of person. And Psalm 1 and Psalm 2 are working together to say the choice is yours. You either can meditate on God's instruction and wisdom, or you cannot. And that's your choice. It's the same choice before the humans in the garden. It's life or it's death. It's listening to God's instruction, or by taking moral autonomy into your own hands and making decisions and redefining good and evil. That's the
mm-hmm,
choice. It's the same choice that gets put before Moses, that Moses puts before the people, pleading with them as he gives his sort of death monologue. He's saying like, I put before you life and death. Like the decision is so simple. Like it's life or it's death. It's one of the two. And so the choice is yours, but I'm telling you that life is the choice to make. And so the question that these two psalms are offering us when we come to meditating on them together is a question of like, well, yeah, what are you directing your attention to? What are you being formed by? It's not a question of whether or not you are or aren't. It's a question of like, you already are. You're already feeling. Everyone has 24 hours in a day. All of us are all focusing our attention towards something, whether it's grad school or parenting or a job or helping a neighbor. We're all directing our attention towards something. And the question is like, is the thing that you're directing your attention to actually making you into the person you want to become?
yeah,
And so that's the meditation on like Psalm 1 and 2, just like within the first few verses, is that the Haggah word used to meditate on the Torah of God is used in Psalm 2 to talk about the plotting of the nations and the plotting of, the empires that be, to say it another way. So
mm-hmm,
whatever this is, like that's at least one of the huge meditations, to just take the words and then just compare their context and say like, oh, they're just assuming that you're meditating on something, and it's either one of these two things. There's no option to say, oh, I'm not being formed, I'm not becoming anyone, I'm not focusing my attention, I'm innocent. It's like,
yeah,
actually, that's actually not the case. Psalm 1 and 2 are very clearly making a statement as you get into to the rest of the Psalter and the rest of the Hebrew Bible, and that's their reflection on Israel's history. Is there was always two choices. There was a choice for life or a choice of death, and that's all it's ever been.
yeah. Wow. Okay. Um, wow. So then, getting back into Psalm 1
Mm-hmm.
for this person who decides to make the decision to meditate on the instructions of the Lord, what's the result? What's the product of that?
Mm. Yeah. Well, this person will become like a tree planted by streams of water, gives fruit in its time, its leaf does not wither, and everything that they do is successful. So notice that the way that this is structured is that they will become like a tree, right? And so
Mm-hmm.
I've already kind of given the punchline away that this is referencing back to Eden, but the idea is that you become a tree planted by streams of water, which is supposed to give you an allusion back to Genesis chapter 1 and chapter 2,
Mm-hmm.
where the humans are placed in the garden. And so the idea is that you become a tree of life. Like you then become this like self-generating life source for other people, which gives fruit in its time, which makes a lot of sense if you think agriculturally. Like most fruits and most trees and plants bloom and produce fruit once a year, most
Mm-hmm.
of them. And that's just the way that it works. But then here's the interesting twist: the leaf does not wither. Now that's weird. Because if you think about agriculture, you're like, no, fall happens. Like
Yeah. Winter,
trees
it's
do
all
this.
gone.
Like, yeah, right. And I'm sure that there's exceptions out there because I'm not an agrarian and I'm not in that world. But it occurs to me that the meditation is like, yeah, of course it bears fruit in season. You're like, yeah, of course. As somebody becomes a life generating source, of course, when things go well and when you've had enough coffee and you're able to love your neighbor as yourself and it feels really easy, of course you'll bear fruit. That totally makes sense. But the interesting twist is like, but your leaf doesn't wither.
Yeah.
You're like, well, that's not normal. Like, what kind of tree is this? Like, so another way to maybe think about this is like in and out of season. And so the meditation then is to say like, if so, actually, here's a good example. So we were just in Zion National Park on a road trip this past weekend, and we were walking kind of near where the Narrows is in the park, and we were noticing that all of the trees that were planted or not planted, they just are. Well, no, they're planted. Somebody else didn't plant them, I don't think. I think they're just naturally there. But the trees that were
Yeah.
planted by the river, that were in Zion National Park, even though they're by river, they weren't bearing any. There was no leaves. Like they had all fallen off. Right? They weren't coniferous. They were deciduous. They weren't evergreens, and so there were no leaves. They were just totally barren. And I asked my wife. I was like, man, how weird would it be if like you walked by and one of these trees just like had all these green leaves on it, like in
Yeah.
the dead of January. You're like that wouldn't make any sense. Like that would actually stand out to you as being really weird and really unique. And the meditation that it kind of led me to was just thinking like, oh yeah, like imagine like the difficult scenarios in our lives that are the hardest to be able to say, God, I trust you, and I will trust that you will get me through this and you will provide no matter what. Like insert any difficult situation, right? And we could even go back to the categories of the plot conflict, crime, war, brutality, famine, whatever it is. Like just look out your window for 10 minutes, and you'll witness how fractured this world is. And so it's saying like even when you put yourself into the Eden garden, and Jesus is the one who leads you into the place where there's life, into the temple of God, into the presence of him. There is something that happens in you where it changes and where you actually have the ability to bear fruit in off seasons. You
Mm-hmm.
actually have the ability to be able to walk with him through whatever situation is there. And so the option isn't like I'm really pushed against the wall here, and so I feel like now I'm going to have to compromise, and I can't do it. There's actually saying like, no, you actually won't wither. Like this is actually a promise that if you actually take into yourself the tree of life, Jesus, you actually take into yourself this fruit that actually does bear life and fruit. Um, you actually don't wither. You actually
Yeah.
can produce fruit out of season, which is again going to stand out among an instance of crime, brutality, war, oppression, dehumanization. To have somebody flourishing in the midst of that circumstance becomes life for other people, which is exactly I think what the whole reflection on Jesus' life is that he actually was bearing fruit in the midst of his
Mm-hmm.
death, and his death then became the way for life for everyone. But everyone was like, that looks like an out of season fruit. That's not supposed to be bearing any fruit. He just died, and
Yeah.
yet he became fruit for all of those who would feast upon his death and resurrection, metaphorically speaking, and I guess literally. But the idea is that you're bearing fruit out of season, and that's possible because you've been given the keys to life. You've been
Yeah.
given access to the garden.
Yeah. And the garden, I mean, I would imagine is also trying to pull on the imagery of a place where death is not, you know?
Mm-hmm.
Like how could you wither in a place where death is not allowed? A place where death does not exist.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly, and that's the reflection then going up because the way that Psalms the verses here in Psalm 1, verses 1, 2, and 3, verses 1 and 3 are actually sitting in a parallel to each other. So in the last line, and does not sit in the seat of mockers,
Mm-hmm.
that word for sit is the same word for planted here
Mm.
in verse 3. So then they will become like a tree planted. So again, it's even forcing a meditation on like you can sit in the seat of those who just perpetuate like irritation for other people, or you can be sitted by streams of water that
Yeah.
lead to life. And so it's even giving you a contrast of like there's a way to exist that is just cynical and agitating and isn't really moving towards anything, right? You're sitting, you're kind of stuck. Or you could be planted or sitting in a place that actually bears fruit for many people. And so it's even just forcing you to be like, there's no middle ground. You're either seated in a seat of agitation of others and cynicism, or you're planted by streams of water. So again, the choice is yours. Like, what do you want to become? I want to
Yeah.
become a tree of life. And so even that's just like another meditation on the psalm, just within the first 3 verses. Like, we haven't even gotten to 4, 5, and 6. That's just 1 through 3.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. Well, then, is there? Well, the very next line that we get to is that everything. Well, in my translation says whatever they do prospers. You read yours as whatever they do shall succeed. I think is
Mm-hmm.
what you said. Help us with this, because I think for me this strikes me as like one of those in Matthew 21. I think when Jesus says like if you believe, you will receive whatever you ask for in prayer. And it's one of those things where I'm like, okay, well, I mean, do you really mean that? It's because I've asked for things in prayer. Pretty sure I believed, but I didn't really see it come to fruition. And this verse, at first glance, strikes me like that. It's like everything that this person does will prosper. Um, is it hyperbolic? Like, is it true? Or what does it even mean to prosper? Do we need to define that? So help us there.
Mm-hmm. Yes. So, yeah, these are all good reflections on what this is doing, and it can certainly give the illusion that it's saying like, no matter what you do, it will be perfect
You
and
win.
everything will be awesome, and you don't have to worry about anything. And I think that that's the illusion that it gives. But again, if we look at the design of the psalm, the next verse in 4 is actually giving you the contrast. So in verse 4 it says, "But not so the wicked," right? The
Mm-hmm.
things that you do lead to success, it leads to goodness and life and peace, but the wicked aren't like this. Why? Well, because they're like chaff, right, that the wind drives away. And so you already have the contrast. There's actually there's a similarity between like a tree and like chaff, and they even look similar in Hebrew. If you were to look at the two words, they actually hold a lot of the same visual representation. So you
Mm-hmm.
actually are forced to even meditate between like a tree versus chaff, and then put them together and meditate on what they're saying, but that the wind drives away. And so even it's just giving you a meditation of an enduring tree that seems to never um, that never seems to die.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas the chaff, the wind comes and it blows it away, right? So there's something that endures and something that's very temporary, something that has long lasting life, an enduring life, and then something that is very short lived, something that
Yeah.
doesn't really hold a lot of value, and even at the most gentle breeze, eventually will wither it away, and then you'll never see it again, and it's just
Yeah.
gone, right? And so
Is,
it's even setting
is
setting
that
up that
wind?
meditation just between like when it makes it successful, we think like, oh, what does that mean? It's like, well, the next verse will help qualify and say that like success looks like endurance.
Yeah.
Like what you do has endurance, whereas the wind drives away something that's very temporary. So even if it's like everything that we do will go and have success, I'll make $1,000,000, I'll do this, I'll get that job, I'll marry that person, like everything I do, it'll be perfect. But it's trying to say this, it's like, no, like you bear fruit in and out of season. Your leaf doesn't wither. You have the ability to be able to have enduring life,
Yeah.
enduring peace that actually over a long period of time, through your meditation day and night, through that meditation, you become someone who someone looks at and they're like, wow, they're so reliable. Like
Yeah.
they're reliable. They are somebody who I look at and I'm like, that they have the good life, and not like the good life as in like the American good life, but like
Yeah.
the like American dreams versus kingdom dreams. Like it's the kingdom dream good life. It's like, wow, their life is not perfect and they don't have everything that they want, but there's something about the way that they live that seems enduring from this age to the next.
Mm-hmm.
There's a quality to it. So it's not that everything goes the way you want, is that there's an enduring quality to the way that you posture yourself towards the world and towards others and to God.
Yeah.
Does that
Yeah.
how's that fit?
Yeah. No, that's really helpful. Well, I wanted to ask, you mentioned the comparison and contrast between the wicked, who are like the chaff that the wind blows away. Is the wind, is that ruach? Like, is that referring to that same word that we often get from spirit? And is there any implications there? Do you know?
Yes, it is ruach. Yeah, so it says here, but lochen, not so, are the harashaim, not the wicked. Um, Hurasheim ki'im kamotz. But like the chaff, it scatters. And it's
Mm,
the wind, the ruach. Yes,
yeah.
the wind scatters it. So yes, it is the word ruach, which can refer to God's wind, breath, wind. The thing that you exhale out of your mouth. All of that is considered ruach.
Yeah. Animating life presence.
Yeah, yeah, yes, yeah. I think that's what we call it, isn't it?
Yeah.
At Bible Project. Yeah, the animating life presence of God. Yes, yeah, that's right.
Mhm. Yeah. Okay. Cool. Um, any further meditations that you think that we need to have in our brain as we continue to read through the Psalms and our own personal lives and within community? Is there anything else that you're saying like, okay, we didn't touch on this, but we need to grasp this before we you know continue on that path?
Yep, yep. That's a good question. If you want to resist the exilic world that we live in, because all of us are technically in exile, we're all outside the garden. None of us are actually in the Garden of Eden. We're all dying out here outside of Eden, and it's tough and it's difficult and it's frustrating because there's suffering everywhere. And to not partake in that suffering and to say, I choose not to live in a world where suffering and death get the last word, then the claim of Psalm 1 is to say, okay, if you want to resist that power, then the way that you get there is by meditating on the Torah day and night, listening to God's voice, because as you do, you actually become a tree of life in a culture of death. Like that's how you make this happen. You want to know where this goes, that's how you start. So it's a universe of wisdom to be able to sit and take in that actually leads you to go out and do the actual things of God. And that's, we could insert Sermon on the Mount and everything that Jesus is then talking about. And he's just
Mm,
like, let me tell you what the kingdom of God is like. You want to know what it's like out here to meditate and be in the garden in a culture and world of death? Well, let me tell you, it's about caring for these people. It's about giving yourself away in selfless love. Like, and then he goes and demonstrates it and shows like, this is what I mean, with his life. And so I don't know, maybe the meditation here is, you know, resisting, resisting, resisting the exilic empire that tells you death gets the last word.
mm,
Death gets the last word. Your suffering gets the last word. Your fractured relationships get the last word. That's what defines you. That's what defines your future. That's what defines your life. And Psalm 1 is saying, like, that's not true. Don't believe the lie. Do not believe the false world that's being constructed for you that tells you suffering is the end, death gets the last word, there's no redemption, there's no way forward. No, there is. And that way is through meditating on God's word, and that leads to life. Listening to the voice of God, listening to the voice of Jesus as the Messiah from Psalm 2, as the one who actually delivers God's people and then brings the Eden life to us, makes us little pockets of Eden. And that's how we can tell and be like, yes, death does not
yeah,
get the last word. Like, life gets the last word, and that life is on offer for anybody. That's, I think,
yeah.
again, the point of the Sermon on the Mount. So another plug to go listen to our, series right now on Sermon on the Mount Bible Project. Go and listen to it. But yeah, that's what I think. What I mean about resisting empire is trying to say it's resisting the empire that tells you that death gets the last word, that suffering is the end, that there's a way of existing that doesn't let dehumanization just be like, oh, we don't have a choice, dehumanization is just the way that we have to live. It's like, no, actually it's not. There's actually a way of life, and God is the one who actually is very prominently like empowering the prophets to make that message ultra clear. Is that you don't need to succumb to Babylon and Assyria. Like, there's actually a very subversive way to live in a culture of death that actually leads to life. And so should you find it, it's, you will spread that life power, that animating life presence to the people who are around you. So
Mm,
I don't know, does that land it to me? It's
yeah,
compelling. I don't know if it's compelling to anybody else, but
yeah.
to me that's
No,
very.
that's really helpful. I think you explained for us what Jesus means when he teaches his disciples to pray and tells them to pray that heaven and earth become one. That yeah, that the kingdom of God uh, becomes ushered in to the land that we roam right now through the people of God. Like, and that's exactly what I think you're describing is by saying we become pockets of Eden. It's like the
Mhm,
overlap of the heaven and earth through the way that we demonstrate God's instruction through meditating on it. Uh,
mhm.
yeah, that's so good. Um, Aaron, thank you so much for your time. Thanks for joining me today. And oh my goodness, I hope that people were blessed by listening to this. I know that I was. So thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a joy to be here and reflect on. We didn't even get to the end. We didn't even get to the end of the psalm. We really just reflected on like 5 verses.
Yeah. Yeah.
We didn't even finish the whole psalm. But yeah, how good is the Torah, and how good is the life for those who meditate on it, right? Like we
How
just
good is
did.
the life for those who spend over an hour on 3 verses?
You know what? I think that's a good way to spend time.
Yeah, there you go. Well, thank you, brother.